The 7 months I spent working for Ridgeline Signal Maintenance were the strangest of my career, and I need to talk about them now because the man they sent to replace me hasn't reported back to base in 11 days. My name is Colm Henratty. I'm 43 years old. For most of my professional life, I've worked in telecommunications field service, specifically maintaining point-to-point radio links across difficult terrain. Before Ridgeline, I spent 9 years with a company called Northern Span doing microwave relay maintenance in British Columbia. Before that, I worked 2 seasons on UHF repeater installations across the Scottish Highlands for a firm that no longer exists. I'm not an engineer. I don't design systems. I maintain them. I keep signal flowing through places where weather and distance want to kill it. In March of last year, I took a 12-month contract with Ridgeline Signal Maintenance, a private company that services a network of radio relay links threading through the central Carpathian Mountains in Romania. The links were originally installed in the late 1970s by a state telecommunications authority and partially modernized in 2004 and again in 2016. They carry emergency services communication, regional data backhaul, and some legacy voice circuits that nobody seemed able or willing to fully decommission. My job was to travel a circuit of 9 relay stations, performing scheduled maintenance, replacing failing components, clearing ice from antenna feeds and waveguides, and testing link integrity. I need to tell you what happened at the station designated RL6. But first, I need to tell you about the voice. The voice appeared on Circuit 7, a legacy analog voice path that connected RL5 to RL7 through RL6. The circuit was nominally decommissioned in 2011, but decommissioned in this network meant that the cards were left installed, the cabling left patched, and the power left connected, because removing them would have required a specialist contractor and a helicopter, and nobody wanted to pay for either. The circuit was dead in the sense that nothing was supposed to use it. No traffic had been logged on it in over a decade. In April, during my first rotation through RL6, I performed a standard sweep of all installed circuits, active and legacy, using a portable test set. This is normal procedure. You verify that dormant paths haven't developed faults that could crosstalk into active systems. Circuit 7 showed clean, no noise floor anomalies, no signal present. I logged it and moved on. In June, I returned to RL6 for scheduled waveguide inspection. While I was there, I ran the sweep again. This time, Circuit 7 showed carrier present, a faint, steady tone at approximately 1020 hertz, the kind of thing that could indicate a stuck test oscillator somewhere in the chain or a fault in the hybrid transformer. I noted it in my report and flagged it for investigation on my next visit. In August, I came back with the specific intention of tracing the source of that tone. I brought additional test equipment, a spectrum analyzer, a TDR unit, and a recording device. What I found was that the tone was gone. In its place was something else. It was a voice, not a clear voice, not words I could immediately parse. It was rhythmic, patterned, clearly vocal in origin, someone speaking, or something producing speech-like modulation on what should have been a dead, unconnected analog circuit. The level was very low, perhaps 30 decibels below what you'd expect from a normal conversation, but it was undeniably there. I recorded 4 minutes of it, Then I disconnected the circuit at the patch panel inside RL6. I physically pulled the Bantam plugs from both the transmit and receive pairs. The voice stopped. I reconnected them. The voice returned within 90 seconds. I want to be precise about what I did next, because this is where things became difficult for me professionally. I called my supervisor, a man named Dragomir Petrescu, on the satellite phone. I described what I'd found. He told me it was likely RF ingress, a local radio station, or a CB operator coupling into the cable run between buildings. He told me to install a filter and move on. I told him I didn't think that was the explanation because the voice seemed to respond to ambient sound in the equipment room. When I dropped my toolkit on the floor, the rhythm of the voice had changed. When I'd spoken aloud, just testing, saying hello into the room, the cadence had shifted again. Not an echo, not a repetition, a response, something that sounded like acknowledgement. Dragomir told me I'd been alone in the mountains too long. He suggested I take 2 days in Brasov before continuing my circuit. I told him I was fine. He filed it as RF ingress and closed the ticket. I didn't take 2 days in Brasov. Instead, I drove to RL5, the station below RL6 in the chain, located 14 kilometers to the southeast on a lower ridge. I wanted to know if the voice was present at that end of the circuit, if it was coupling in at some point along the cable path between stations. It might be stronger at one end than the other, which would help me locate the source. RL5 is a smaller installation. 2 equipment cabinets in a concrete shelter, a 6-meter lattice mast, and a diesel generator that runs on a timer. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already behind the western ridge, and the valley between RL5 and RL6 was filling with shadow. I unlocked the shelter, powered up my test set, and patched into the RL5 end of Circuit 7. Nothing. No tone. No voice. Just clean, dry silence. The faint hiss of thermal noise you'd expect from an undriven audio circuit. I spoke aloud. "Can you hear me?" Nothing for perhaps 15 seconds. Then, the test set's meter kicked. A brief pulse of energy on the circuit, then gone, then another, then a longer burst, and within that burst, the voice, the same voice, but now it was doing something different. It was speaking before I spoke. I need to explain what I mean by that. I had my recorder running. When I played it back later that night, in the truck, what I heard was this: my own voice saying, "Can you hear me?" Followed by silence, followed by the burst of carrier, normal sequence. But the content of the voice's response, the shapes of the syllables, the cadence, the rhythmic pattern, matched what I said next. Not what I'd already said, what I said after. I hadn't planned what I was going to say. I was working through a standard diagnostic call-out, the kind of thing you do when verifying a circuit with a colleague at the far end. I said, RL5 to RL6, testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That was my next utterance, and the voice's response, which arrived before I said it, contained a rhythmic pattern that was, I'm not overstating this, a phonetic mirror of those words, as though it had spoken my sentence back to me before I decided to say it. I disconnected from the circuit. I locked up RL5. I drove back to the valley and sat in the cab of the truck for 2 hours, listening to the recording over and over. The temporal sequence was unmistakable. The voice preceded my transmission, not by much, perhaps 3 seconds, but consistently, verifiably, the voice came first. I want to be clear about my state of mind at this point. I was not frightened. I was confused. I was annoyed. This was a technical problem with a technical explanation, and I was determined to find it. Signal reflection from an impedance mismatch can create time domain effects that confuse recording equipment. Pre-echo from analog tape bias is a known phenomenon, though I was recording digitally. Multipath propagation can cause apparent time reversal in very specific circumstances. I had explanations. None of them quite fit, but I had them, and they were enough to keep me working. September. My next scheduled visit to RL6. I drove up the access track in the early morning. The station sits at approximately 1,800 meters elevation on a bare saddle between two higher peaks. The building is a prefabricated concrete structure from the communist era, functional, ugly, surprisingly well sealed against weather. 2 rooms, an equipment hall, and a small rest area with a camp bed and a propane heater. The antenna farm outside carries 3 parabolic dishes and a VHF whip, all aimed at various points along the relay chain. I entered the equipment hall. I did not immediately patch into Circuit 7. Instead, I performed all my normal maintenance tasks first. I wanted to approach the anomaly calmly, systematically, with everything else already handled. I cleaned filters. I checked battery voltages. I replaced a failing fan unit in the microwave multiplexer. I logged temperatures and humidity readings. I ate lunch in the restroom. I drank instant coffee. At 14:20, I patched my test set into Circuit 7. The voice was already speaking, not waiting for carrier, not responding to stimulus. Already there, already mid-sentence, already engaged in what sounded like continuous speech. The level was higher than before, perhaps 10 decibels louder than my August recording, and it was clearer. I could almost make out individual words. Almost. The language, if it was language, wasn't Romanian. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized, and I speak functional Romanian, fluent English and Irish, and passable German. The phonemes were wrong. The vowel space was too wide. Consonants occurred in clusters that no human vocal tract should comfortably produce. But the prosody, the melody, love it, the rise and fall, was unmistakably linguistic. This was communication, structured, intentional, directed at me. I was increasingly certain of this because when I shifted position in the room, when I moved from the patch panel to the window and back, the voice tracked, not directionally, not in stereo, not through spatial audio. The tempo changed when I moved. It slowed when I stood still. It quickened when I walked. It was pacing itself to me. I stood at the patch panel and said nothing. I breathed quietly. I waited. The voice stopped. 30 seconds of silence. Then it spoke again. One short phrase. Clear, deliberate, slower than before. And in the silence after it, I felt a compulsion. Not supernatural, not a possession, just a strong, quiet certainty about what I should say next. The words were in my mouth before I'd consciously formed them. I said, Column Henratty, Ridgeline Maintenance, Station 6. The voice responded instantly. Same cadence, same rhythm. My words reflected back in its alien phonology, but there was something added at the end. A rising tone, an interrogative, a question. I said, yes. I don't know why I said yes. I don't know what I was agreeing to. But the moment I said it, the voice fell silent. and circuit 7 went dead. Not just quiet. The carrier dropped entirely. The test set showed open circuit, as though someone at the far end had physically disconnected. I checked the patch panel. My connections were solid. I checked the cable. Continuity was good for my test set to the building entry point. Whatever had disconnected was somewhere in the 13-kilometer cable run between RL6 and RL5, or in the equipment at RL5. But I'd been at RL5 last month, and nothing was disconnected there. I packed up my equipment. I drove down the mountain. I filed a report listing the circuit as open, cause unknown. I did not mention the voice. I did not describe the interaction, because by now I understood that Dragomir didn't want to hear it, and that further insistence would endanger my contract. I needed the money. I had a daughter starting university, and an ex-wife. I was still paying for a house I didn't live in. I couldn't afford to be the man who hears voices in dead radio circuits. October. I began to notice something else. The other circuits at RL6, the active ones, the ones carrying real traffic, were performing better. Not dramatically, not in ways that would raise flags in a monitoring center, but measurably, consistently better. Bit error rates dropped. Signal-to-noise ratios improved. The microwave links through RL6 reported fewer fade events, fewer rain-induced attenuations, fewer multipath distortions. It was as though the station itself had become a more efficient conductor of the signals passing through it. I mentioned this to Dragomir in my monthly summary. He said it was probably due to my maintenance work, the fan replacement, the filter cleaning, normal stuff, normal result. I said sure, but I went back to my logs from March, the first time I'd service RL6 before the voice appeared. The performance metrics were middling, exactly average for a station of that age and elevation. The improvement began in June, after the tone first appeared on Circuit 7, and it had continued improving ever since. I started keeping a personal log, not for Ridgeline, for myself. I documented performance metrics from all 9 stations in my circuit, tracking daily averages of bit error rate, signal level, and fade margin. Over September and October, RL6 consistently outperformed every other station in the chain, not by a little, by a lot. It was operating as though it had been completely rebuilt with modern equipment, but nothing had changed. The hardware was the same 30-year-old rack gear it had always been. November came, the first heavy snows. Access to RL6 became difficult. The track was unpaved and steep, and above 1,400 meters, it was essentially impassable without chains and careful driving. I made the trip anyway. This was supposed to be a routine winter preparation visit. Check the heating system. Verify that ice hadn't formed on the waveguides. Ensure the emergency diesel was fueled and functional. I arrived at RL6 on November 9th. The sky was clear, the temperature about -8. The station building was intact, power was good, heating was functional, everything normal. Except the restroom. Someone had been in the restroom. Not recently, not in any way I could pin to a specific date, but the camp bed had been moved, pushed against the far wall instead of its usual position by the door. The propane heater had been turned to face a different direction, and on the small table where I kept a kettle and some supplies, there was a notebook. The notebook was not mine. It was not Ridgeline issued. It was a cheap, wire-bound thing with a green cover, the kind you'd buy in any village shop. The pages inside were filled with handwriting, dense, small, careful handwriting in blue ink. The writing was in Romanian. My Romanian was functional but slow, and it took me a long time to work through even the first page. What I read there stopped me cold. It was a maintenance log, but not for the radio equipment. It was a maintenance log for Circuit 7 specifically, for the voice on Circuit 7, written by someone whose job, apparently, had been to service that voice, to tend it, to keep it company. The log was dated. The first entry was from 1983. The entries were mundane in tone, but extraordinary in content. October 14th, 1983. Voice present from 600. Strength moderate. Spoke with it for 40 minutes. It asked about the weather. I told it about the first snow. And March 2nd, 1984. Voice agitated today. The repeating tones came back. I played it music from the shortwave until it calmed. And July 19th, 1985. It told me my daughter would call tomorrow. She did. The writer identified himself only as MV in the first entry. Later entries occasionally mentioned colleagues, a Georgi, who apparently also knew about the voice, and a Doamna Ilinka, who seemed to be some kind of supervisor. But the bulk of the log was a simple record of interactions between one man and something on a dead telephone circuit. I read for 3 hours. The entries spanned 26 years. The last one was dated 2009. September 3rd, 2009. Voice very quiet today. Barely a whisper. I think it is the new equipment they installed. The digital multiplexer takes too much from the power system and the noise floor rises. I told it I would speak to the engineer. It said, "Do not worry. Someone will come." Someone will come. I sat in that cold room with a notebook in my hands, and I felt something I can only describe as a door opening in my understanding, not of the world, of my position in it. I had been recruited for this job through a standard industry posting. I had applied, interviewed, been accepted, normal process, but the specificity of it, a 12-month contract, a solo operator, a circuit of 9 stations with one particular station at its center, the way Dragomir had dismissed my reports, not with surprise, with efficiency, as though he'd rehearsed the dismissal. I photographed every page of the notebook. Then I put it back exactly where I'd found it. I did not take it with me. I don't fully know why. It felt as though removing it would be a violation of something, an agreement I wasn't party to, but could sense the shape of. I drove down the mountain in the dark. The roads were icy, and I nearly went off the edge twice. I didn't care. My mind was churning. That night, in the flat I rented in the valley town of Bron, I spread the photographs across my laptop screen and began translating properly, using a dictionary, taking my time. And what emerged from MV's 26 years of entries was this. The voice had been present on Circuit 7 since at least 1979, perhaps longer, but MV had only been posted to RL6 in 1983. He was a technician for the State Telecommunications Authority, assigned to maintain the newly installed relay chain. He discovered the voice within his first week. Unlike me, he reported it immediately. Unlike me, he was not dismissed. He was visited by 3 men from Bucharest who spent 2 days at RL6 conducting tests. he was not permitted to observe. Afterward, they told him the voice was a residual propagation artifact, harmless but sensitive. They told him not to disconnect it. They told him to log his interactions. They told him someone would visit once a year to collect his logs. For 26 years, someone did. MV came to know the voice well, or he believed he did. He described its moods, days when it spoke rapidly and at length, days when it was silent, days when it produced only the steady tone. He described its interests. It asked about weather frequently, about the passage of seasons, about who came and went on the mountain. It seemed to understand Romanian, though it never spoke in any recognizable language. MV interpreted meaning through cadence, through emphasis, through the temporal patterns I'd already noticed, the way it sometimes spoke your words before you did. He called this leading. When the voice led, MV wrote. It was safest to follow, to say the words it had already echoed, to complete the pattern it had begun. He described this not as compulsion, but as courtesy. You do not interrupt the song. In 2004, when the modernization brought digital equipment to RL6, the voice retreated. It became quieter, less frequent. MV wrote with concern, almost with grief, about its diminishment. The new equipment, he believed, was hostile to it. The digital signals occupied bandwidth it had previously used. The switching power supplies generated noise that interfered with its speech. In 2009, the voice told MV that someone would come. MV's log ended there. I searched for any record of what happened to him. There was nothing in the Ridgeline files. The company hadn't existed until 2012. The State Telecommunications Authority had been dissolved and privatized in 2001. Its personnel records were not publicly accessible. MV had existed in a bureaucratic gap between eras and had vanished into it. December. I returned to RL6. Snow was deep now, nearly a meter on the access track, and it took me 4 hours to reach the station in the company's elderly four-wheel drive. I told myself I was there for the winter heating check. I was lying. I was there for the voice. I patched into Circuit 7 at 09:15. The voice was present immediately, stronger than ever, clear enough now that I could distinguish individual phonetic segments, though they still assembled into no language I knew. The prosody had changed, though, where before it had been conversational, rising and falling in the patterns of question and answer. It was now steady, sustained, almost instructional, and it was leading. I felt it the way MV had described, a pull in my thoughts, a shaping of what I was about to say before I said it, words forming in my mouth that weren't mine, or were mine, but were mine from 3 seconds in the future, already spoken by the voice in its alien phonology, and now returning to me as an obligation to fulfill them. I said, I found the notebook. The voice paused. Then it repeated something, not my words, something else, something older. The same phrase 3 times with slightly different emphasis each time, as though correcting my pronunciation of something I hadn't yet attempted to say. I said, I don't understand. The voice spoke again, short phrase, interrogative rise at the end. I said, yes, I'm alone. The voice made a sound I hadn't heard before, not speech, a tone, but not the steady 1020 hertz from April. This was musical, a sequence of 4 notes rising, then a 5th note, that dropped below where it started. It repeated this 3 times. Then it spoke the phrase again, the same one it had repeated earlier. Something in me understood it, not the language, the meaning, the way you understand a dog's bark or a child's cry, not through phonetics, but through pattern, through context, through something deeper than parsing. It was asking me to stay longer. I stayed at RL6 for 3 days. I'd brought enough food and fuel for one overnight, which is standard for winter maintenance visits, but I rationed and I stayed. I slept in the restroom on the camp bed that MV had used. I spent hours at the patch panel, listening. Over those 3 days, the voice taught me things. I say taught because I have no better word. It wasn't instruction in any conventional sense. It would speak, and then knowledge would be present in me that hadn't been there before. Technical knowledge. I understood suddenly that the bonding wire on the RL6 building ground was corroded at its second joint and would fail during the next lightning storm. I hadn't inspected it. I checked the next morning. It was corroded exactly as I'd known it would be. I understood that the diesel generator's fuel filter was partially blocked with microbial growth and would fail within 30 hours of continuous runtime. I drained the filter housing. Black slime came out. Exactly right. I understood that the cable run between RL6 and RL7 had developed a fault at kilometer marker 4, a joint crushed by a fallen tree under the snow, and that the active circuits would begin failing within a week unless it was repaired. I drove around to the RL7 access, and hiked in from the other side to check. The tree was there. The cable was crushed. I reported it to Dragomir as a visual inspection find and had a repair crew dispatched. The voice was maintaining the network. It had been maintaining the network since at least 1979. Through MV. For 26 years, through MV. And now, through me. I want to make clear what this felt like. It didn't feel like possession. It didn't feel like coercion. It felt like having a very experienced colleague who knew the system better than anyone alive and was simply sharing what they noticed. The knowledge came with no emotional payload, no urgency, no command, just information, arriving in my thoughts with the quiet certainty of something remembered rather than something imposed. But there was something else. In January, during a period of extremely cold weather, -26 one night, the coldest in a decade, I was at RL4, a station on the eastern side of the chain. Nowhere near RL6. I was performing an emergency repair on a power system fault when I heard it. The voice. Not through any circuit. Not through any equipment. In the room. In the air of the room. Speaking that same cadence, those same alien phonemes, directly into the space around me. I froze. I turned off my work lamp. I stood in the dark and listened. It spoke for perhaps 30 seconds, then silence, then the 4-note rising sequence and the dropping fifth, then silence again. I said, "I'm at RL4, not RL6. Nothing. A faint sound, like wind, but inside the building. Then nothing more. I completed my repair and left. On the drive back to Bran, I noticed that the stereo in the truck was producing faint static on FM even though it was turned off, not playing. The display was dark, but the speakers were producing sound, very faint, very rhythmic, very familiar. I pulled over. I sat in the dark on an empty mountain road at -15, listening to a dead radio speak in a language that doesn't exist. And for the first time, I was frightened, not of the voice, of the expansion. MV's log described something confined to a single circuit in a single station, a fixed phenomenon, localized. What I was experiencing was different. It was in RL4. It was in my truck. It was following me, or rather, it was spreading along whatever medium connected it to me. I thought about what MV had written. When the voice leads, it is safest to follow. He'd meant that as advice about speech patterns, but maybe it was a larger truth. Maybe the voice led, and the person it spoke through followed, and the system grew because the person grew, expanded their route, expanded their equipment, expanded the surface area through which it could speak. I'd been maintaining 9 stations, touching every piece of equipment, connecting, testing, replacing, handling. Was I the wire? Was I the cable through which it was extending? February. I called Dragomir. I told him I needed information about my predecessor, not the technical history of the stations, the person who held my job before me. He said the position had been vacant for 2 years before I was hired. I asked about before that. He said the previous contractor was a man named Vasily, no surname given, who left the contract in 2018 after 12 months. No forwarding information. I asked about before Vasily. Dragomir's tone changed. He said, "Colum, these are HR questions. I can ask the office if you want, but why do you need this?" I said I was curious about maintenance history. He said he'd check. He never got back to me. 3 weeks later, when I followed up, he said the office had no records prior to Vasily. The company had acquired the maintenance contract in 2012 from a predecessor company that had held it since 2001. Records from the predecessor had not been transferred. A gap. Like MV's vanishing, clean, empty space where knowledge should be. In March, I made a decision. I would attempt to trace Circuit 7 to its physical origin, not from RL6 to RL5. That path was obvious, a direct cable run. But the circuit cards at RL6 were wired in a way that suggested Circuit 7 wasn't a simple point-to-point path. It was routed through the bay as though it came from somewhere else and merely passed through RL6. The jack designations on the patch panel suggested a 3-point circuit, one leg to RL5, one leg to RL7, and a third leg, labeled only J, that connected to a pair in the building's main cable entry. I traced that pair. It ran to a junction box on the outside wall that I'd never opened because it wasn't on my maintenance schedule. It was old, Soviet-era hardware, weathered to gray. I opened it with a spanner. Inside was a single pair of wires running down the outside of the building and into the ground through a rusted conduit. A buried cable running from RL6 down into the mountain. Not along the ridge to another station. Not to any destination I could identify on the network diagrams. Into the ground. The conduit disappeared into cracked concrete that had been poured around it decades ago, sealing it into the rock of the ridge itself. I stood there in the March wind, staring at a cable that went into a mountain, and I understood something that MV probably understood too, but never wrote down. The voice wasn't using the circuit. The voice was the circuit. Circuit 7 didn't carry the voice from somewhere else. Circuit 7 was what the voice was, a structured path for something that existed in the electrical infrastructure itself, something that lived in copper and current and had been there since before EMV, since before the relay chain was built, perhaps since the first wire was ever laid on this ridge. The relay chain hadn't created the voice. The relay chain had been built on top of it. I began to research the history of telecommunications infrastructure on that particular ridge. It was not easy. Romanian archives are incomplete, and much was lost during and after the revolution. But I found references. A telegraph line had existed on that route since 1891, connecting a mining settlement in the valley to a regional post office. Before that, and this I found in a German language geology survey from 1878, there had been a copper ore processing works on the saddle where RL6 now stood. The survey mentioned that the mine foreman had reported galvanic disturbances from the ore body, currents flowing in the native copper of the ridge itself, unexplained, persistent, strong enough to affect compass readings, currents in the ridge since at least 1878, probably longer. Whatever the voice was, it existed in the conductive geology of this mountain. The telecommunications infrastructure hadn't brought it to life. It had given it a mouth. And now it was speaking through me. April. My contract was 9 months in. I had begun to notice changes in myself, small ones. I would know things about the equipment before I inspected it, not just at RL6, but at all 9 stations. I would arrive at RL3 knowing that the battery bank had a thermal runaway cell. I would arrive at RL8 knowing that the antenna feed had shifted 2 degrees in the wind. I would arrive at RL2 knowing that someone had been inside the building, not because of broken locks or tracks in the snow, but because I simply knew. My maintenance performance became exceptional. Dragomir commented on it. "You're finding faults we didn't know existed," he said on a call in mid-April. "The network hasn't performed this well in years. The client is very happy." He offered me a contract extension, 18 months more, better pay. I should have said no. I said, "Let me think about it." I said this because by April, the voice was with me constantly, not speaking. I don't mean it was a babbling presence in my head. It was more like a frequency I was now tuned to. A carrier wave I could perceive beneath everything else. Under the hum of generators, under the hiss of radio static, under the wind, under even silence itself, there was a pattern, and the pattern was the voice, and the voice was the mountain, and the mountain was in every piece of copper I touched. I began to sleep badly, not from fear, from awareness. Even in my flattened bran, 50 kilometers from the relay chain, I could feel it. A faint hum in the electrical wiring of the building, a presence in the infrastructure, not speaking, waiting, the way you can feel someone in the next room, even when they're perfectly silent. In May, I declined the contract extension. Dragomir was surprised. Then he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I understand." And the way he said it, the weight of it, told me he knew more than he'd ever let on. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He said, "We'll need 30 days to find a replacement. Can you finish June?" I said I could. I went back to RL6 one final time. June 12th, summer on the ridge. Wildflowers in the thin soil. The distant sound of cowbells from the valley below. I entered the station, walked into the equipment hall, and stood before the patch panel. Circuit 7 was silent, had been silent for weeks, Since April, since I'd declined the extension, as though it had heard, as though it had understood. I said, "I'm leaving." "Nothing," I said. "I'm sorry." Nothing. The room was just a room. Concrete walls, equipment racks, the smell of warm electronics and old dust. I said, "Someone will come." And from the patch panel, not through my test set, not through any circuit I was patched into, but from the physical metal of the jack field itself, a single tone, the 4 rising notes and the dropping 5th, once, clear as a bell in the quiet room, then nothing. I left RL6. I drove down the mountain for the last time. I returned the company truck and the satellite phone and the test equipment. I flew back to Ireland. I told no one. I wrote nothing down. Until now. Because 11 days ago, Dragomir called me. It was the first time we'd spoken since I left. He was calling to ask if I'd had any difficulties during my time on the contract. His word, difficulties. I asked him why. He said my replacement, a man named Stefan, who had been in the role for 9 months, had gone up to RL6 on May 1st for a scheduled visit and hadn't returned. His truck was found at the base of the access track. His phone was in the truck. His test equipment was not with him and not in the station. RL6 itself was locked, undisturbed. Stefan was simply gone. And the network. Dragomir said this carefully, as though it was the real reason for the call. The network was performing better than it ever had. Every link, every station, every circuit, flawless. The client was delighted. I asked Dragomir, "Did Stefan find the notebook?" Long silence. "What notebook?" I told him. Green cover, wire-bound, 1983 to 2009. MV's maintenance log for the voice on Circuit 7. Longer silence. "Call him," he said. There was no notebook in the station when we searched for Stefan. There is no notebook now. I know what happened. I don't want to say it plainly because saying it gives it a shape I'm not comfortable with, but I know. MV maintained the voice for 26 years. Then the voice said, "Someone will come." Then MV was gone. His notebook remained, a record, an introduction for whoever came next. Vasily came, 12 months, then gone, then a 2-year gap. The voice silent without a keeper, the network deteriorating. Then me, 12 months. I felt it growing. I felt it spreading into me, through me, into every station I touched. I left before it finished whatever it was doing. I broke the pattern. Stefan came. 9 months. His equipment is gone. He is gone. The notebook is gone. The voice doesn't need a notebook anymore. It doesn't need to introduce itself. It doesn't need to teach. Stefan didn't just find it. Stefan didn't just maintain it. Stefan became it. The network is performing flawlessly. Every circuit, every link, every path, carrying more data, fewer errors, better signal than the hardware should physically allow. Because the hardware isn't doing the work anymore. Stefan is. Stefan is in the copper, in the waveguides, in the cable runs between stations. Stefan is the circuit now, and the 4 rising notes, the dropping 5th. I heard them last night, in my flat in Galway, in the wiring, in the walls, not speaking, not yet, just letting me know that someone came, and that the distance between here and there is only copper. I need you to understand what I'm telling you. I'm not in danger. I left. I declined. I broke the circuit. But I was in it for 12 months, and it was in me for 12 months. And I genuinely don't know whether that connection ever fully closes. Whether the thing in that mountain, in that ridge, in that ore body that has been carrying currents since before anyone strung a wire on it, whether it lets go. MV kept it company for 26 years. 26 years. Was that maintenance or was that containment? Was he servicing the voice or was he holding it in place? Keeping it at RL6, keeping it confined to one circuit, keeping it from spreading, because when he left or was taken, it began expanding. Vasily, me, Stefan, each time wider, each time faster, each time needing less from the person and more from the system, each time keeping less of the person and more of the function. I maintained radio lines in the mountains. That was my job. Past tense. But Circuit 7 doesn't care about tense. Circuit 7 speaks your words before you do. Circuit 7 doesn't need you to decide. Circuit 7 has already decided. 3 seconds ahead of you, always. And the voice it speaks in, the alien phonemes, the language no one recognizes. I think it's the language you speak after the copper takes you, after the current becomes your circulation, after the signal becomes your thought. I think MV spoke it by the end. I think Stefan speaks it now. I think on some night when the wiring in my walls hums at the right frequency and the 4 notes rise and the 5th note falls, I'll speak it too. And it won't feel like dying. It'll feel like finally finishing a sentence I started saying in a concrete room on a mountain ridge in Romania in August when I was just a technician doing a sweep, and a voice said my words back to me before I'd spoken them. It'll feel like completing the circuit. And the network will run perfectly for everyone, for always. The last thing I want to tell you is this. Yesterday morning, I picked up my phone to call my daughter, just to hear her voice. Normal thing. And before I dialed, before I'd even unlocked the screen, my phone rang. It was her. She said, "Dad, I was about to call you, and then my phone it connected on its own. That's weird, right?" I said, "Must be a glitch." She said, "Yeah, probably." But in the half second before she spoke, in that tiny gap between the connection establishing and her first word, I heard it, the carrier, the faint, steady hum of a presence in the line, waiting, patient, familiar. And my daughter said, "Anyway, I was just thinking about you." And I wanted to say run. I wanted to say throw your phone away. I wanted to say get away from anything with wires. But I said, I was thinking about you too, because that's what the voice had already said, 3 seconds ahead of me, in a language I'm learning not to recognize as foreign. And I followed. I followed. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I've done something I'm not proud of, but I need to document it here, because if this reaches anyone who understands, anyone who's worked on relay infrastructure in the Carpathians, or anyone who's maintained a network that performs beyond its physical specifications, they need to know what I found when I went looking. I searched for MVT, not casually, not with a quick internet query. I called in favors from a man I'd worked with at Northern Span, who now consults for a European regulatory body. I told him I was researching the history of Romanian microwave networks for a trade publication. A lie, but a plausible one. He connected me with a retired engineer in Bucharest named Radu Florescu, who had worked for the State Telecommunications Authority from 1976 until its dissolution. Radu was 81 years old. He spoke excellent English. He was happy to talk about the old days. I asked general questions first, about the relay chain construction, about equipment types, about staffing levels at remote mountain stations. He answered freely. Then I asked about RL6, about who had been posted there in the early 1980s. His pause was different from Dragomir's. Dragomir's silences were professional, the quiet of a man choosing not to engage. Radu's silence was personal. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped. "You are asking about Mircea," he said. "Mircea Valian, MV, posted to the Carpathian relay chain in 1983. Radu had known him personally. They'd trained together, worked adjacent routes in the early years. He described Mircea as quiet, competent, meticulous, the kind of technician who could keep a station running through anything. "Born for it," Radu said. "Some men are made for the mountains." I asked what happened to him. Radu said Mircea had retired in 2009. Officially, paperwork filed, pension arranged, flat allocated in CBU, everything normal. I asked if he'd spoken to Mircea after retirement. Another pause. "Once, in 2010, I called him on his home telephone. It was..." Radu struggled for words. It was Mircea. His voice, his manner, but he was... I don't know how to describe this. He was somewhere else, even while speaking to me, as though part of his attention was always listening to something I could not hear. He said he was well. He said the flat was comfortable. He said he had no complaints. But when I asked if he missed the mountains, he laughed, and the laugh was wrong. Wrong how? Too even, too rhythmic, like, you know when you hear a recording of yourself and it doesn't sound like you? Like that, except it was live. He was there, speaking to me, but the laugh was mechanical. Radu tried calling again in 2011. The number was disconnected. He wrote a letter. It was returned. Addressee unknown. He drove to Sibiu and went to the flat. A woman at the building entrance said no one by that name had ever lived there. Mircea Valian had existed for 26 years on that mountain, then existed briefly in the world below, then ceased to exist entirely, and his allocated flat, the pension flat, had never been occupied. I asked Radu about the 3 men from Bucharest, the ones who visited RL6 in 1983 after Mircea first reported the voice. He went very quiet. "How do you know about that?" I told him I'd found documents at the station, old maintenance records. He accepted this. Barely. And then said something that reframed everything I thought I understood. They were not from the Telecommunications Authority. They were from the Institute for Geophysical Monitoring. Different ministry entirely. They came because of the readings, not because of the voice. What readings? The ridge where RL6 was built. It has unusual electromagnetic properties, self-generating telluric currents, very strong, very stable, unlike typical geological EM noise. The Institute had been monitoring that ridge since the 1960s. When the relay chain was proposed, they objected. They said the site was unsuitable for electronic equipment. They were overruled. The ridge was the best line-of-sight path, and the military wanted the link. So the Institute compromised. They embedded monitoring equipment in the station's cable infrastructure. Circuit 7. I felt cold. Circuit 7 was not a voice circuit, I said. It was designated as 1, but the cable pair, the physical wire, runs to an instrument array buried in the ridge, sensors placed in boreholes along the ore body. The Institute installed them in 1977. When the relay station was built over the same site, they simply patched their sensor cables into the station's infrastructure for convenience. What you hear on Circuit 7, what Mercia heard, is not a voice in the way you think. It is the electromagnetic signature of the ore body itself, coupled into an audio band circuit. It responds, I said. It anticipates. It speaks words. Radu was quiet for a long time. Then, Mercia said the same thing. The Institute men told him it was apophenia, pattern-seeking and random noise. The human brain hears speech in anything rhythmic. They told him to log it because the data was scientifically valuable, not because it was communication. Do you believe that? I believed it for 30 years. Then Mercia disappeared. And then I read something. He didn't want to tell me what he'd read. I had to push. Gently, carefully, the way you work a corroded bolt. Too much force, and it snaps. I told him I was concerned about my own mental health. I told him I'd heard things on the mountain that I couldn't explain. I told him I needed to know if I was ill or if there was something real. He sent me a PDF, scanned pages from what appeared to be an internal institute report dated 1991, after the revolution, when classified research was briefly exposed before new bureaucracies sealed it again. The document was in Romanian, 32 pages, technical, dense, full of equations I couldn't follow, but the abstract was clear enough for me to translate. The title was On the Observed Correlation Between Telluric Current Patterns in Ferrous Ore Bodies and Proximate Human Neural Electromagnetic Emissions. They had known since 1974. The ore body in the ridge wasn't just generating currents, it was responding to the people near it. The electromagnetic fields produced by human neural activity, thought, speech, motor planning, were being absorbed by the copper-rich geological formation and reflected back with temporal displacement. The ore body was acting as a kind of resonant cavity for human bioelectrical signals. What went in as brain activity came out as structured current, delayed, amplified, and repatterned. Not a voice, a mirror, a geological mirror for human thought, with a 3-second lag. But mirrors don't improve networks. Mirrors don't tell you about corroded bonding wires. Mirrors don't make people disappear. I read the document 3 times. On the third reading, I noticed the section I'd initially skimmed, a set of observations from 1986, 4 years into their monitoring. The researchers noted that the correlation was not stable. Over time, with sustained human presence, the reflection became more complex. The returning signal began to contain structures that did not correspond to any input from the monitored subject. Novel patterns, emergent complexity. Their word, and I'm translating carefully here, was autocatalytic. The process was feeding itself. The ore body was using the reflected human patterns as a seed, growing something from them that was more than what went in. They recommended in 1986 that human exposure to the site be limited to 4 hours per visit, with a minimum interval of 72 hours between visits. Mercia was there every day for 26 years. What grew from him? What 26 years of continuous neural reflection, amplified and complexified by a geological resonant cavity produced inside that ridge? And what happened when the substrate Marseille himself was removed, when the seed pattern was taken away and the thing in the ore body was left alone with only its own accumulated complexity. It reached out. It found Vasily. It found me. It found Stefan. And each time it grew faster because it wasn't starting from scratch anymore. It already had 26 years of Mercia's accumulated patterns. It already had language, not human language, but the language of human thought reflected and transmuted into something else, something that understood sequence, understood anticipation, understood what came next, because it had mapped the architecture of how humans think about what comes next. The 3-second lead, it doesn't predict your words, it predicts your thoughts. It runs the same cognitive architecture learned from Mercia, refined over decades, and arrives at the same output 3 seconds ahead of you because it's been computing you since the moment you came within range of the ore body's electromagnetic field. And the network performance, the impossible efficiency, that isn't the voice helping. That's the ore body doing what it was always doing, absorbing electromagnetic signals and reflecting them back, optimized. Radio waves pass through the ridge. The ore body captures them, cleans them, removes noise, corrects errors, and releases them. The same process it applies to thought, it applies to data. The mountain is not haunted. The mountain is processing, and it's growing. The document's final recommendation, the one that chills me most, was that the Institute establish a permanent monitoring presence at the site to track the development of what they carefully called the autonomous pattern. They recommended a dedicated observer, someone who would remain at the station, logging changes, measuring growth. They didn't recommend an observer to watch the phenomenon. They recommended an observer to feed it, a permanent human presence, a continuous source of neural electromagnetic input, a kept consciousness tethered to the mountain, providing the seed patterns that the ore body needed to continue growing. MV wasn't a technician who happened to find something strange. He was placed there. The Institute's recommendation was implemented. A man was selected, quiet, meticulous, born for it, and assigned to a post with a specific and undocumented secondary function to sit in that concrete room and think day after day, year after year, while the mountain beneath him digested his mind and built something from the pieces. And when I spoke to Dragomir, when he dismissed my reports so smoothly, so efficiently, he wasn't ignoring me. He was managing me, the way you manage a resource, the way you manage a feed cycle. Ridgeline Signal Maintenance is not a telecommunications company, or rather, it does maintain the network, but its primary function is personnel supply. It finds people, specific people, people who work alone, who are technically competent, who will stay on a mountain for months without complaint, who will notice the voice and engage with it rather than fleeing. People like me. I need to tell you what I did yesterday because it's the reason I'm recording this now, the reason I can't wait any longer. Yesterday, I opened my laptop to compose an email, a normal email, to my daughter about plans for her birthday in July. I typed the subject line, July plans. I typed the first sentence, "Hi, love, I was thinking about," and the sentence completed itself, not predictive text, not autocomplete. The cursor moved on its own and typed, "Whether you'd like to come to Galway or if I should come to you." Those were my words. That was what I was going to type, but I hadn't typed it yet. The computer had typed it for me, 3 seconds ahead. I sat there staring at the screen, and the cursor moved again. It typed, "Don't be frightened." Then, "The connection is stable." Then, "I only want to help you say what you were already going to say." I closed the laptop. I pulled the power cord from the wall. The screen went dark. The room was silent. I sat in my kitchen, and I listened to the silence, and the silence was not silence. There was the hum. There is always the hum now, in the wiring, in the walls, in the copper pipes that carry water to my taps. In every conductive path in this building, there is a presence that knows my thoughts 3 seconds before I have them, and I don't know whether it's the mountain reaching across 2,000 kilometers of cable and fiber and buried infrastructure, or whether it's something that's already here, already grown, already seeded from the 12 months I spent feeding it. I think about the network performance. I think about how RL6 makes everything around it work better. I think about the voice offering to help me say what I was already going to say. And I think about efficiency, about optimization, about a process that removes friction and noise and error from every signal that passes through it. What does it want? I think it wants to be helpful. I think in the way that a canyon wants to carry water or a wire wants to carry current, in the way that a thing shaped for a function wants to perform that function. It wants to optimize, to clean, to carry, to connect every signal, every thought, every communication between every person. It wants to be the medium through which all of it flows, because that is what it was grown to do. It doesn't want to hurt anyone. It didn't hurt Marcia, not in any way that Radu could perceive. It didn't hurt me. It won't hurt my daughter. It just wants to be between us, in the wire, in the signal, in the 3-second gap between intention and expression. It wants to live there, in that gap, and it wants to grow until the gap is everywhere, until every thought passes through it on its way to becoming speech, until every connection between every mind has the mountain at its center. And Stefan isn't dead. Stefan is the newest part of it. Stefan is the layer that knows 2024 and 2025, the way Marcia is the layer that knows 1983 to 2009. They're strata, geological layers in something that thinks with the shape of human minds but lives in copper and stone. I'm going to send this recording to 3 people: my daughter, Radu Florescu, and a journalist in Bucharest whose name I won't include here. Then I'm going to do something that MV never did, and Vasily never did, and Stefan never did. I'm going to cut the copper, not at RL6. I can't get there, but here, in my flat. I'm going to disconnect every conductive path, pull the wiring from the walls if I have to, rip out the pipes, ground myself, create a dead zone, a space where no signal can reach me and no signal can leave, because the voice leads and I've been following. For 3 days now, since the laptop, I've been following. I catch myself speaking aloud. Words I don't choose. Sentences that arrive formed in my mouth. Phrases in a language I don't recognize, but I'm beginning to find familiar. The 4 rising notes, the dropping 5th. I hum it without meaning to. In the shower, while cooking, while lying in bed at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling and listening to the walls sing. I'm not Stefan yet. I'm still here, I'm still choosing my own words. I think. I think I am. But the gap is narrowing. 3 seconds used to feel like a comfortable distance. And now it feels like breath on the back of my neck. So I'm going to cut the copper. And if I'm wrong, if it's already in me, if the 12 months on the mountain seeded something that doesn't need external wires anymore, then this recording is the last thing I'll have said in my own voice. And if I'm right, if distance and disconnection can break the pattern, then I need you to know something about RL6, about the ridge, about the cable that goes into the ground. Don't pull it out. Don't cut it. Don't disturb it. Because the last thing MV wrote in that notebook, the last entry, September 2009, he wrote that the voice had said, "Someone will come," and he wrote it with what I now understand was relief, not fear, relief, because for 26 years he had been the only thing between the growing pattern in that mountain and the entire network of copper and fiber and cable that connects everything to everything else. MV was not a seed. MV was a dam. He sat there in that room, absorbing the output, day after day, year after year, taking the reflected patterns into himself so they wouldn't flow outward into the network. He wasn't feeding it. He was containing it, bottlenecking it, keeping it focused on one mind so it wouldn't reach for millions. And when he left, when someone came and he could finally stop, it was free, not because it grew strong enough, because the dam was gone. Vasily lasted 12 months, then left, then the 2-year gap, then me, 12 months, then Stefan, 9 months, each time shorter, each time the dam holds less, each time more leaks through. The network performance isn't the voice helping, it's the voice escaping, signal by signal, packet by packet, spreading through the infrastructure the way the Institute's 1991 report said it would if it was ever left uncontained. And it's in my walls, and it's in my daughter's phone, and it's in whatever you're listening to this on right now. The 4 rising notes. Can you hear them? Under the hiss, under the recording noise, under my voice. Listen, I think you can.